Reformation Fellowship provides support and fellowship to all who would stand for the reformation of Christ Church worldwide. We long to see the church revitalized by the gospel and seek to encourage all who share that vision. We gather together for gospel-hearted fellowship around gospel-minded theology. We are a ministry of unity. Hello and welcome back to the Reformation Fellowship Podcast. I am your host, Justin Schell. We're so glad that you've joined us wherever you are in the world, and we hope that our time together strengthens your heart as you seek to know Christ, and that it strengthens your hand as you seek to make him known to those around you. I want to make you aware of our website, reffellowship.org, refellowship.org. That's where you can find out more about what we are all about here at the Reformation Fellowship, and we can keep you updated on news about events, resources, the gatherings, etc. Chatting with us today is Dan Cruver, Director of Student and Family Ministries at Heritage Bible Church in Greer, South Carolina, as well as the president and co-founder of Together for Adoption, and is also the author of a book published by Cruciform Press called Reclaiming Adoption, Missional Living Through the Rediscovery of Abba Father. Dan, we're thrilled to have you join us for this conversation today.
Thanks for having me, Justin.
Absolutely.
Glad to be with you.
Yeah. For those who may not know you, Dan, tell us a little bit about yourself. Help our listeners know who you are and what you do.
So I've been married to Melissa for 28 years and coming up on 29 here. Have a daughter who's 24, got married in this past COVID year. And then she lives in Charleston. Have a son who's a freshman at North Greenville University. And then a son who is a junior in high school. And I serve as Director of Student and Family Ministries at Heritage Bible Church, and with the primary responsibility of leading our high school and college ministries and primary teacher. And that's what I do full time. And then have the opportunity to serve with Union US too, which has been a great honor and joy for me the last several years. Before being on staff here where I am currently, for about 8 years, led Together for Adoption, started back in 2008. And our primary focus is to think through the theology of adoption as it relates to orphan care and families deciding to adopt children, just helping Christians to think theologically about it. And so the book, Reclaiming Adoption, Missional Living Through the Rediscovery of Abba Father, kind of grew out of those first couple years of Together for Adoption. That provided me an opportunity to help serve the church to think theologically about orphan care and children who are in need of a family.
Yeah. Dan, what caused the theology and practice of adoption to become something important for you?
We had our daughter back in 1996, and then in 1999 we had a son who ended up having a brain disorder called infantile encephalopathy, which is a brain disorder of unknown cause. And he would have 40 to 70 seizures every day. And so we were taking him to various doctors, took him to Duke University and Emory and Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. And then the last major one was Johns Hopkins, who told us that there's a likelihood if we had another child biologically that there was 25% chance that they'd have the same brain disorder. And so so he had an extended, he lived for 3 years, died about 5 weeks after his third birthday. And he suffered constantly through the entirety of his life.
Yeah. And
so the Lord used our suffering in those 3 years, and then the news of the potential of our next child having the same condition to move us into thinking about adoption. So I think the suffering aspect paired really well with thinking through. And I was in church ministry at the time, pastoral ministry. And so I was beginning to think theologically about adoption. And then that led into me going to teach theology at a university in northeastern Pennsylvania, where I was able to devote a considerable amount of time to thinking theologically about adoption, how it related to suffering. And so that kind of shaped how we did Together for Adoption. I think when we looked at the global orphan crisis and the church's engagement in serving children who are orphaned, either lost one parent or both parents, and the suffering that was involved in their experience, I think it paired really well with laying out a paradigm of the theology of adoption that embraced an understanding of suffering and how God works within time to bring about ultimate renewal, and how that should inform how Christians think about and engage caring for orphans in their affliction.
Yeah. So maybe let's camp out there for a minute. You guys are experiencing suffering. It's leading you to think about the practice of adoption that then dovetails into thinking about the theology of adoption. Let's, for the listeners, help us understand when you say theology of adoption, what do you have in mind?
So when I say adoption, there's only one biblical author that actually uses the term, weathesia. So it's translated a number of ways. Often it's translated as a phrase, adoption as sons, and there are some translations that'll say translate it sonship. But the Apostle Paul is the only one who actually uses the term. So when I'm thinking theology of adoption, my primary focus is to say, all right, what is Paul doing with the term? And he uses it 5 times. And what he actually does with it is he uses it to trace the entire story of redemption from before time, Ephesians 1, 4, and 5, all the way to the consummation of redemption with the redemption of our bodies. So Paul is tracing it. So not only are we thinking theologically about what does God do in adoption, but we're also thinking redemptive historically, God's work throughout time to bring fallen sons of Adam to himself through Jesus, and climaxing at the cross. And then what is our experience between the cross of Christ and the return of Christ as adopted sons? And then what is the hope that we live with in between these two times as we await our adoption? Paul says in Romans 8:23, the redemption of our bodies. So that's what I'm thinking of when I say theology of adoption.
Yeah, so stretching back eternity past, the Father sets his heart on children, on adopting. And then in time, we see Christ coming as the Son, and then but not keeping his sonship just to himself, but giving it to us as the Father calls us into the family. And in a sense, in terms of the time frame here, we are adopted. We are co-heirs with Christ. We are children of God. And yet there is some, it sounds like future fulfillment, fuller fulfillment, you might say, that still awaits. Is that right?
Yeah. So Romans 8 makes, so when Paul says in that section of Romans 8:23, where he says we're groaning inwardly like creation as a whole. So creation has been subject to decay because of Adam's sin. So the created order is in this period of suffering. And so creation's groaning, inanimate creation is groaning. And so Paul says, and we who have the first fruits of the Spirit, we groan inwardly too. And in our groaning, what comes out of that is an eager awaiting for the completion, the finalization of our adoption, which is actually the redemption of our bodies. And so we enter into the fullness of our adopted position. And Paul says in that chapter as well that when that creation is awaiting for its freedom, which will be revealed when the children of God are revealed. And so the fallen world and all the suffering that takes place and all that's broken with time and space is actually awaiting for the revealing of the sons of God, the children of God.
So you could say that God's answer to the broken cosmos is adoption.
Yep. Yeah. So you can even refer to redemptive history I think this is Dave Garner, Dr. Dave Garner at Westminster. He likes to refer to it as adoptive history.
Mm.
And I think that's a great way. I think it's beautiful in that saying adoptive history actually puts the Father's love through the Son in the Spirit in the center of what our triune God is doing throughout the entirety of redemptive history.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's awesome. Well, then let's take that. So that's the theology of adoption, but we're talking about sonship and suffering. How we see that at the end, the answer to the groanings of all creation is sonship. How has the theology of adoption been a support for you personally during times of trial?
So what I have found especially helpful, and it's something that I really try to lean into, is two times when Paul uses the word adoption: Romans 8:14 and 15, and then Galatians 4 verses 4 through 6. And in verse 6 there, he says in Romans 8 that it is by the Spirit of adoption that we cry, Abba, Father. And then Galatians 4:6, he says, so the Son was sent by the Father to redeem us for adoption as sons. And then verse 6 says, and since you are sons, so the Son was successful in accomplishing our adoption. He says, we've been given the Spirit of his Son, who cries in our hearts, Abba, Father. So the only other time that the words Abba, Father are found on the lips of a man in the New Testament is in the Garden of Gethsemane in Mark 14, where Jesus, Mark's the only one who gives this to us, is when Jesus is saying, not my will, but your will be done. He cries out, Abba, Father. And so there's Jesus, a very intense suffering as he's on the very precipice of the cross, and he cries, Abba, Father. And so there's a Jesus is actually drawing us in by the Spirit into not only participating in his suffering and the benefits of his relationship with the Father, but that actually I've find that to be extremely encouraging and comforting, that when I find myself crying Father in I've had some really dark nights of the soul. When I find myself crying Father, the Spirit uses that to show a fellowship with Jesus in his sufferings. That Jesus is allowing me to call upon the Father. His suffering in the Garden of Gethsemane was infinitely worse than any suffering I experience now, and yet he does not minimize our suffering, but he invites us by his Spirit. So the Spirit's work, if we can't by the Spirit cry Abba, Father, the Spirit cries Abba, Father within us. And so that over and over again has given me immense comfort while I'm suffering, and maybe can't articulate much beyond that.
Yeah. So I can, as we've been talking about this, I can see how, okay, this is helpful for me in my walk with the Lord, especially in tough times. But is this really as important as it sounds like? I mean, you've led an organization, you've taught Bible and theology, you're currently on staff with the church. Is understanding our adoption actually important in all those roles? Or maybe another way to say that, how has the truth of the doctrine of adoption served you as a leader, as well as those you've served in those different contexts?
Yeah, I think, it certainly does. I mean, when Jesus gives us, what we call the Lord's Prayer, calling God our Father can't happen unless adoption is a reality, is the reality. So there's no way into sharing the Son's relationship with the Father other than through adoption. So it puts us at the very center of Christian life, both objectively and subjectively. So objectively, there is no knowing God as Father unless the work of Jesus as the Son sent to become one of us, to redeem us unto adoption. And that's what Paul says in Galatians 4, is sometimes we think that redemption is was God's primary objective, but Paul says that we were redeemed unto adoption. And so connecting adoption with redemption is actually showing that redemption itself is to put us in relationship with the Father and the Son and the Spirit. So it has implications for not just, how we think of children who are in need of families, but our Christian experience and how we relate to Him and how we disciple others in their living in the reality of the gospel.
Could you unpack that a little bit? What does it look like to have adoption shaping the way we disciple?
I teach high school students and college students, and this year I've been taking them both through Ephesians. So we're about halfway through with both groups. And what I love about what Paul does there is, he starts out chapter 1, verse 3, blessed be the God and Father of our Lord Jesus Christ, who has blessed us with every spiritual blessing or every blessing that belongs to the Spirit in the heavenly places. And so Paul begins this letter by highlighting the generosity of the Father and what the Father has already provided us through Jesus Christ. And at the very front end of that is he puts adoption, that this work, which we see in redemptive history unfolding, actually began before creation when God predestined us to adoption as sons. And so how we think about every aspect of Christian doctrine in Ephesians and Christian behavior in Ephesians all links back to God being a very generous Father to us. And chapter 1, verse 10, he says that his objective is to unite all things in heaven and all things in earth in the Messiah Jesus, which is pointing us forward to the day when everything in heaven and earth is renewed, and we're living on a new earth, and we're able to do so because we have a Father who is incredibly generous to us. And so the more we understand the Father as generous toward us and as someone who is inclined to give to us all of these great, gracious gifts and to be merciful to us, when we begin thinking about what does the behavior of a Christian look like, we are obeying the commands of Scripture, not in order to earn the favor of God as a judge, but because we are lavished with God's fatherly gifts, His goodness to us. And so it really begins to change the motivation for why we do what we do. Knowing that we're fully accepted by the Father in the Son. So reorienting a high school guy's thinking towards a father, and not all high schoolers have loving fathers. And so I think a key discipleship point there is to say, well, let's let the fatherhood of God define how we understand fatherhood. And you can see that slowly begin to change the way they view their own fathers, and they find themselves better able to submit to their fathers who may not do a good job with them overall.
Walk us through maybe a relationship with a young guy who you're discipling. I mean, I can just imagine if they were a young man like I was, one, they would have thought of God as maybe a cosmic hall monitor, or James Torrance calls that kind of God a contract God. You've got something you need to do, and if you fulfill that contract, then maybe God will bless you or let you live, or depending on how bad how badly skewed your idea of God is. How do you start to walk with guys and gals, young people, from that place where they're much more Islamic in their view of God than Christian, really, to understanding adoption?
Well, my approach is in all my teaching with teens. So I've been on staff here at this church for 3 years now. And so over time, I really put the accent on who the Father is, what is his disposition to us. So in all my teaching, that's where I really put the accent on the kindness of the Father. So whenever we're talking about a text that is pressing up our responsibility before God as image bearers, and we're feeling the weight of that responsibility, I always try to accent that here is the Father's disposition to you.
Yeah.
And I see over time, high schoolers begin to ask questions because it really is difficult to believe that the Father is so inclined to shower his goodness upon us. I think it's Walter Marshall in his book, The Gospel Mystery of Sanctification, says that it is impossible to obey God if you're not convinced that he loves you. And so in all my teaching, what I'm trying to do, both with high schoolers and college students and with the parents of our high schoolers, is to convince them that the Father loves them. And that takes that is what sanctification is. I think Sinclair Ferguson, in his book The Children of the Living God, he's dealing with Luke 15, what we call the parable of the prodigal son. And he says, I'm paraphrasing, that the prodigal's suspicion was that the Father really doesn't delight in him, that the Father really doesn't love him. And we all carry that prodigal suspicion.
Yeah.
And so I'm convinced that putting the accent and the stress on who the Father is, that behind, I think T.F. Torrance talks about, he was a chaplain in Europe, and he had a young 19-year-old soldier about to die, and the young soldier asked, is there another God behind the back of Jesus? And the gospel is no. You have the Father behind the back of Jesus, and what you see of Jesus is what you see of the Father. So I think that's just the key to discipling, not just young people growing up, but even adults in their latter years of life, believing, being convinced that the Father does indeed love us and delight in us.
I came to the theology of adoption, certainly not in high school or college, but as an adult, and it is what you're saying here, that I had to have my view of God completely renovated. It had to be discipled out of me, these bad ways of thinking about God. I remember one time just praying, and before I could stop it, it slipped out. I said, God, I feel like you're just putting up with me.
Yep.
And not an audible voice, but a sense, I think the Holy Spirit convicting me. The comeback was, what kind of a God do you think I am? What must you think of me? How bad of a father must I be for that to be the case? And that was part of the turning point. It was recognizing how off on God I was, but then having friends, mentors, authors, writing, speaking, helping me see more clearly. And it's made the biggest difference in my life. So I'm thrilled to hear that that's happening for 14, 15, 16, 17, 18-year-olds and older.
Well, everybody's hungry for it. That's what it's such good news, but it's good news that we've got to hear over and over. I think Walter Marshall also said that sanctification involves both the constant unlearning of our fallen condition, where we easily find ourselves falling into a legal spirit where we feel like we have to earn God's favor. So we have to constantly unlearn that, and then we have to constantly relearn that the Father loves us, and that's where sanctification, that's where growth happens.
Yeah. Now you've talked about the youth there at the church. What about their families? Are you, as the theology of adoption good news for families? Is it impacting the fathers that you know there, the mothers, the daughters, the sons that you're working with there?
Yeah, I've had early on, I had two fathers mention to me that and this was probably within a 3-month span, mentioned to me that they intentionally want to make it difficult for their children to confess their sins to them,
Mm, mm,
which is really a failure to understand the fatherhood of God. I think that understanding comes from seeing God primarily as judge, and not because of Jesus primarily our father, because God moves from judge to father for us when we're adopted
mm,
into the household of God. And so I see that. I saw that, and that was one of the reasons why, I said the doctrine of adoption and the fatherhood of God is so essential to parenting, because it does shape the way you view your relationship with your children and your efforts to disciple them. Because obviously these fathers care about the spiritual state of their children, but their approach was not being informed by the fatherhood of God, which
mm.
then makes you think, okay, so they're probably like me in that they're struggling with being convinced that the Father loves them as well.
Yeah.
So it's a common struggle, and one of the things that we try to do every year. So this before we jumped into Ephesians with the teens in September, we did a full Saturday, 4 hours of me meeting with parents and anyone else in the church who wanted to participate, and kind of walking them through Ephesians from the angle of the generosity of the Father toward us.
Mm,
So exploring that, unpacking that, so that the parents and these dads and moms would feel the generosity of the Father toward them right now,
mm,
and then make applications, getting to chapter 6, and how the children are to relate to their parents, obey in the Lord, and then fathers not provoking their children to anger.
mm,
And I think understanding the Father's generosity toward us, and how that actually wins our hearts to Him. So we're not afraid to approach Him. We're not afraid to confess our sins, because we already have His full acceptance. That I think over time we'll see more and more fathers having their relationship with their children transformed.
Praise God. Yeah. Well, speaking of families, Dan, I know that you guys have recently gone through a very unexpected and difficult season as a family. You lost your mom and dad, both to COVID, and both within about 48 hours of each other.
Yep.
How does adoption carry us through heartbreak and loss like that?
Well, I mean, I touched on this when talking about Jesus in the Garden of Gethsemane.
Mm,
Um, but where it's really, I mean, especially the days leading up to the death of my parents, when we kind of knew that dad was going to die, but had hope that mom was going to live, and having to make decisions for dad and for mom without them being involved in the decision-making process for each other. Just the weight of those decisions, and knowing what the outcome was likely going to be for dad, and then finding very quickly that that was going to be the same outcome for mom.
yeah.
My prayer life really boiled down to just being able to muster the word Father.
Mm,
That was really the extent of my prayer, and saying it over and over and over, and doing that in a way that didn't feel like, okay, God's not going to hear me, because I'm not using I'm not praying apparently rich theological prayers, but knowing that because of adoption, because I'm united with Jesus, adopted in the Son and through the Son, that saying Father was perfectly aligned with what Jesus even did in the Garden of Gethsemane. And
mm,
so I found great comfort in knowing, even with the brevity of my prayer, the Father was hearing it, and the Spirit was taking those groaning, because really when you're in the midst of suffering like that,
Yeah.
we have the Spirit of adoption who is interceding for us, words that we cannot utter. And so that's really what in those weeks, that's really what my Christian faith boiled down to, was just that God is my Father.
Yeah. Yeah. Such a rock, such a foundation in the midst of suffering, to know that
Yep,
that
really is.
unshakable decree that we belong to Him
Yep,
changes everything.
really does.
Well, Dan, let's say I'm a minister and I find myself in what feels like an unbearable season, maybe of pain, maybe it's because of loss or betrayal, or just worn out. But I'm leading God's people, and I'm just empty. What would you want that minister to know?
So besides what I've already talked about, what I find myself leaning into, because grief doesn't just happen when someone dies, but grief can happen with the death of what we view our ministry to be, or what we had hoped it would be, the death of relationships.
Yeah.
Grief always accompanies those things. And so what I do, and this largely become more and more of an instinct to me, is I go to John 11, where you have Mary and Martha lost their brother Lazarus.
Yeah.
And Jesus delays intentionally so that the glory of the Father can be revealed in raising Lazarus from the dead. So as he approaches Bethany, Martha comes out to him and says, "Lord, if you had been here." So she's obviously hurting deeply, profoundly.
Mm-hmm.
And his simple answer to her is to say, "I'm the resurrection and the life." And she affirms that. And then Jesus continues on, and then he sees Mary and weeping, and the Jews that are with her. And what I love about, so this always helps me immensely, is that what Jesus did with Martha, he doesn't do with Mary. So she's grieving deeply, and Jesus could have repeated to her, "Yes, I told Martha that I'm the resurrection and the life. So I've got this, and here's what I'm about to do. Don't grieve anymore." He does not interrupt her grief. He does not minimize her grief. He actually steps into it with her, and he actually faces the grief with anger towards that which caused the grief, and that's death.
Yeah.
And Jesus greets death with anger. And I think John Calvin says that he didn't come as a spectator, but he actually came as one to wrestle with our greatest enemy, death itself, which is the cause of all our grief. And so when John 11:35 says Jesus wept, the Jews look at Jesus and go, "Oh, how he loved Lazarus." And so I think what Jesus does there is he frees us to grieve really deeply. And sometimes you hear people say, "Well, we grieve, but we grieve as those who are not without hope." But that doesn't mean our grief is any less. I think it frees us to grieve even more deeply, because Jesus, it can be argued that he grieved more deeply at the death of Lazarus than Mary and Martha did. Because he knew what death actually brought into God's good world, and the rupturing of relationships that death caused. And so I think Jesus frees us there, not to run from our grief, but to actually allow grief to deeply affect us, and not be afraid of it, and not feel like it's to grieve deeply is to be less Christian, or less, as someone might say, less spiritual, but actually the way by which we come to terms with sin and death's impact upon the Father's good world, and what it is that Jesus has come to do. And so Jesus then, what we are impotent against, he steps in and conquers it for Lazarus there, looking forward to the day when he himself raises from the dead. And so this fits right in with adoption, that we're awaiting for that final realization of our adopted sonship when we receive the redemption of our bodies. So that's just that whole line of thinking has been really helpful for me with whatever kind of grief I'm dealing with.
Yeah, that's good. Well, as we wrap up here this episode, Dan, give us your recommendations. We love resources here. So someone maybe is brand new to the theology of adoption, or maybe there's some people who are listening who they've got a pretty good foundation, but want to press in and make this more central to their lives and thinking. What are a handful of resources you would recommend?
So I would I always like to recommend Sinclair Ferguson's little book, Children of the Living God. He does a great job of, so it's not about adoption proper as I defined it earlier. It's only dealing with the Pauline text, but he's more dealing with the theology of being a child of God broadly. But he does a great job of tying it into Adam being an image bearer, and that's actually tied into him being a little s son of God that had sinned and been banished. And so he does a great job of bringing it all together and showing the great love of the Father and how it should encourage us in our daily walk with him. So that's a really helpful book. It's more on a devotional side. For someone who wants to go deeper into the theology of adoption itself, it's a book by Dr. Dave Garner called Adoption. I just forgot the title. Sons in the Sun, I think is the title of it. I'm sitting on my Sons in the Sun, I think it is.
Okay. Yeah.
Dr. David Garner. It's probably close to 400 pages, but it's probably the most thorough treatment out there right now. Well, it is the most thorough treatment on the theology of adoption. Okay.
Well, on the page for this episode, we will be sure to put both of those as well as your own Reclaiming Adoption for our listeners to consider. And let me, Dan, just say thank you so much for being here with us on the Reformation Fellowship Podcast.
It was my pleasure to do so.
Yeah, it's been a terrific finale for the first season. Thank you for ministering to us, for sharing your experience as well as your wisdom with us and our listeners. And to our listeners, our time is up. We would love to stay in touch with you. The best way to do that would be to head over to reffellowship.org. That is refellowship.org. Sign up for our newsletter. We'll be able to keep you updated on upcoming events, upcoming resources, upcoming gatherings, etc. Thank you again for joining us here on the Reformation Fellowship Podcast. God bless.